Yeah. Thank you, Felix. Fantastic presentation. Super interesting. Now the plan is to have statements and first questions from our two panelists who haven't spoken so far. And then we open the floor for questions from you. And so let's start by alphabetical order. Ihua, would you like to make a statement? And maybe if you have questions to the speakers, please go ahead.
Is it on?
Yes.
Yes, I think I have several questions because the topic was really interesting. First, I think maybe, can I call you Felix or? Okay, Felix. So we had a small talk before the conversation. So we talked about copyright and the patent. And you mentioned that in China, there are already copies appearing in the market. So, so this may be one challenge you meet in China. And on the other side, you said that China is a very fast developing market for you. So I'm wondering, what do you think is the biggest challenge and the chances you have in the Asian market you see for the next 5 years?
Yeah. We were going through this back and forth before we made the decision to sell our technology into China. And of course, we had filed for a couple of patents. First patents were granted, a couple of designs that we had protected. However, I never had any illusions in terms of that you could totally protect your technology through filing for a couple of patents. And this might be, possible in pharmacy. However, in the field of high tech, I always quote the example of the iPhone. When Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone in 2007, he knew very well that he had kind of developed and built something great. So, with all the power and money of Apple, he tried to protect that, and it didn't help him at all. Nowadays, every single smartphone that is sold looks exactly like an iPhone. And I think the only thing that can really protect you in that very specific field of technology is being super fast. Of course, now we see some first copycats showing up in China. Luckily, they are still very bad. To some extent, they are even using kind of pictures that were taken at Technical University in the marketing material, which is quite hilarious. That's not going to be very difficult to shut down. Our investors have seen quite some of that stuff, and we have a law firm in China that protects our interest. However, much better and smarter copycats are going to show up that don't do it that obvious, and you can always work around these patents. So the only thing that really helps you is when the copycats copy stuff that you kind of brought to market 3 years ago, you're already ready to release your new and next version of your technology, and that's exactly what we are doing. And I think just the chances on the Asian market, specifically on China, are by far too large and outweigh the risks. And even if we wouldn't be there and wouldn't bring the technology there, I'm still absolutely sure we would be copied. So I think not going there was not a decision or not an option for us at all.
If I may make a suggestion, I mean, that is obviously a very important question, and the question of intellectual property protection came to me as well. But maybe stepping one step back, do you have more general comments about these questions of European Union, innovation in the European Union? You've traveled various countries here, and maybe you have a bit of an outside perspective despite your studies here. If you want to make such a statement, or have questions to Peter or more to Felix, of course, it's all very welcome.
For the international students, I'm from China. For many of my Chinese friends who come to Europe, one of the most happy things for them is that with only one visa from one country, you can travel to so many European countries. So I think since I have been in Europe for 8 years, one of my biggest advantage I get from this European Union is that with one visa from Germany, I can travel to so many countries without any application cost. And also, I will go to the Switzerland this year in the winter for exchange semester. And I also get a scholarship from the Swiss mobility program. And I think this kind of Erasmus program encourage really the students to exchange other countries. It's really a great program. In China, I don't see that we have those kind of program which support the bachelor students to go outside. I mean, like this kind of level. And also, I see that I have been to Croatia recently. I'm just wondering why they don't use euro. So, my general comments on EU is that me personally, I profit from it, and I really like that European Union is already built after I come to, before I come to Europe. And I also see many challenges now, like the Great Britain, the Brexit.
Yep.
But I have also read on the history of Britain, the relation between Britain and the other European countries. I see that Britain was the initiator of this kind of union, and then they quit, and then they come into the union again, and then they quit again now. So I think maybe it's just because if it brings them more profit or disadvantages. So I'm thinking about if the Great Britain may some days later join the European Union again.
We'll see.
Yeah, we will see, yeah.
Thank you very much. Then maybe, Nadine, would you also maybe like to make a statement and have questions so to get the conversation going?
Yes, I want to talk about my Erasmus semester at the University of Ghent. It's near Brussels, so of course I visited the European institutions in Brussels, and I was really impressed by the powerful atmosphere around there. And in Ghent, I met so many people from different cultures, and now I have friends in whole Europe who I can visit and spend my holidays there. Without the European Union and the Erasmus program, all of these would not have been possible in this easy way. And because of this, I think it is really important for us as students to stand up against the tendencies of protectionism of some countries, and to use the European Union to transfer our knowledge and our human capital to between the countries of the European Union.
Thank you. Would you like to ask a question to the speakers, or shall we
Just
open the floor?
I want to open the floor.
So, do you have questions or statements? You're also welcome to make a statement if you see things differently. There's one in the back. There's a mic coming to you.
Hello, so to introduce myself first, my name is Alan Wang, so I grew up in Germany, but I'm also Chinese. And this is my question because it is really hard for me to understand this European identity. I have my German identity, but usually when I would talk to somebody, I only say I'm German, either German or Chinese, but saying European is something very, very weird. And I think this is also something which happens to a lot of our younger generation. And if you say that we should enforce the European Union to some extent, then we also need to enforce this European identity. And what is the best solution, in your opinion, to the panel, or especially to Mr. Berkowitz?
Sorry, you want to take that?
Right. Well, thank you for the question. It's a very good and a very big question. And I think that the question is not one of either or, and perhaps that's one of the mistakes that has been made. It's not the question, you don't have to become less German to become more European. I think it's the question of how you bring these things together. And you said you spent time in Belgium. Now, in Belgium, they managed to have a very, very strong regional identity, a very, very strong European identity, and a bit of a national identity. So I think the question is how you get them to work together. And part of this is having common projects and shared histories. And I think that's one of the aspects of the younger generation is that they do forget why Europe is there. Europe is there originally because of the endemic wars there were on the European continent. And it's been very successful, and to a certain extent it's a victim of its own success, and it is a factor for peace more generally, and it received the Nobel Prize a few years ago for this. But that is very, very abstract, and I think that there are other challenges that Europe face which will be important for its identity in the future. And the story I was telling about globalization is one about fragmentation and the challenges that people are facing. And if Europe can't find answers to some of these questions, then it's going to be in a very, very difficult situation. Now, I'm not a great believer in easy solutions. I think this only evolves. And I think things like Erasmus, where simply the possibility to go and live in a different country. I think, you know, this is, when you speak to young people, they are very, who have done Erasmus, they're very at ease with the idea of being European. They don't feel that they've lost their identity. I think collaboration between business in particular, I think businesses, and if you speak to businesses in Europe which work across borders, they no longer think in national terms. They think in European terms. They think of the European market. And the more we can encourage collaboration, the more we will be able to build up this European identity. But, as I said, I don't think there are any simple solutions to the problem.
If I may, I would like to add briefly two things. One is the thing that Hanna Milanov mentioned, that she noticed kind of feeling European somehow when she came to the US. The same thing happened to me. I spent nearly 2 years in Boston, and from that perspective, you see many commonalities in Europe. And the other parallel is to Germany. We still have these jokes about Bavarians and Prussians, which goes back to the time when Germany was not really a nation state. I mean, people still feel themselves Bavarians, but probably more German than Bavarian. So I see the same thing happening on the European level, but it's a personal perception, obviously. Anybody wants to add, or shall we ask for more questions? Yes, Falek?
Hi, sorry. I'd like to comment on the last thing that you said, that you were in Boston and you spent there, and then you have like the Germany and Bavaria, so all the different provinces. But I think what makes a difference between Europe and Germany and the provinces is we don't have a European pass. We have still the national passes, so we still don't have that common identity. So that's one comment, and I have a question to Mr. Berkowitz as well. I think if you say you want to encourage and enhance innovations throughout Europe or European Union, if you think about the United States, for example, you also still have regions with much lesser innovation and with regions that are a lot of innovative. So is it really possible to spread innovation around the entire union, or what do you think?
Okay, well thank you for the question. The discussion we're having in Europe is also being had in the United States. And the idea is not that everybody does leading ed research in everything. The idea is that different parts of a country or the European Union or even the United States try and focus on doing what they do best, and they try and improve their ability to innovate at whatever scale they are. In some parts of Europe, the innovation is a much lower level, and you can achieve real economic benefits by introducing very simply more modern business methods, certain types of IT. So it's a question of bringing everybody up. Now, the story I told is a very, very simple story. It's like saying, you know, you have a school class where you have some very good students, and you have a class where you have some students who are having more difficulties. Now, the question is, what is the best way of raising the average of the class? The best way of raising the average of the class is to work both with the best students and with the students who aren't performing so well. Particularly, and this is what is specific to innovation, is that there is a pull effect. That is to say that when you have an economy in which you have highly innovative companies, this has spillover effects for other parts of the economy. So it's not a question of saying everybody can be the same. It's saying everybody can do better. And we see that there is significant potential to do this. And I think if you ask the question in the United States, you would get the same answer.
I'm tempted to make a brief comment on the European passport thing. If you arrive at a European airport, there's this counter saying European Union arrivals. It's not exactly a passport, but it makes a difference in terms of waiting time.
And just to say, I mean, you benefit, for example, if you're in a foreign country, from consular support from any consul which is in the European Union. I mean, there are whole lots of little things which are there, and perhaps one day we will have a European passport. Seems to make sense to me, but we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you. My name is Paul Wacker. I'm teaching here at the university and on intellectual property, as I'm 40 years a patent attorney. And my question goes to Mr. Berkowitz. I see, especially with the students here, but also everywhere, that when they have a good idea, mostly they talk about that idea and destroy the novelty and cannot get any longer a patent. We had in Germany 6 months of inventor's grace period. This was waived in favor of the European regulations, while United States still has 1 year. So when we have software inventions here in Germany, when the master thesis is published, the students go to the United States, file for a patent, and get a valid patent and sell it off. So we have no good framework in Europe for the startups, for inventors' grace period, for software, and so on. So my question is, do you see any chance to support our young people, our startups, with a new inventors' grace period, at least 6 months, even when the United States asks for 1 year?
Thank you. I'm not an intellectual property expert, so that's the first thing I'd say. I think that one of the things that I didn't talk about is that clearly we need to do more to make the regulatory framework friendly to innovation, to startup and business. And there's a lot of work going on this. My recollection is that the European patent had a lot of difficulties in terms of its negotiation, with difficulties in agreeing, and this became an area which became rather stuck. I think that then finally they found a solution. But I get the impression that particularly with the political changes in Europe, with perhaps the British going, these questions, there's a willingness to reopen these questions because there is an awareness that the environment is not sufficiently favorable. But on the specific question, I can't give you an answer now. I can check and I can come back to you if you like.
If I may add a little bit, I think the entrepreneurship education has picked up considerably at German universities and certainly at TUM. And one of the things they learn is how to get patents. And that partly addresses that issue. I mean, you just don't blow your secrets. And you first file a patent if you really want one. So I think it's getting better despite the lack of grace period. More questions? Oh, even 2 in the back.
while you were talking about advantages of the EU, what big disadvantages do you see justified, or do you see yourselves? This question is addressed to Mr. Bankovitz at first, but of course everybody can comment.
Well, you get all the questions.
Oh, okay, well, the disadvantages of the EU. I mean, I think that, well, I'll give you my frank opinion. I think one of the problems with the EU is that the EU brings with it a lot of change. If you look at something like the single market, if you look at the negotiation of trade agreements, if you look at competition policies, there are always winners and losers. And I think that the European Union doesn't always explain very well what it's doing. So it finds itself in a situation where it is being blamed for the bad bits, while the good bits the credit is taken elsewhere. That's one thing. So I think there's a question of explaining what it does, which I don't think it does very well. I think the second thing is that its decision processes are not very transparent, and people don't understand. And this is a big disadvantage. I wouldn't say that the policy decisions themselves are particularly problematic, because they're taken normally on a basis of a decision between all the member states. But because there is a lack of transparency, because there is not a European government, there are always questions about the legitimacy, particularly when the decisions are difficult. So I would say that the disadvantages or the difficulties that the European Union have is perhaps more to do with the way in which it works and it relates to its citizens than the actual things that it brings. But I come back to this point, is decisions on policies always create winners and losers. And one of the difficulties in Europe is that while Europe can take decisions on things like trade, single market, etc., which will affect people in specific areas, it doesn't have a lot of power over, for example, social security, unemployment, or things like this. So this perhaps is an area where it's a bit weak, and it has to work with the member states. So that perhaps is also one of its weaknesses, is that sometimes it takes decisions where the consequences can only be addressed by member states, and they don't always do it properly.
If I may add a little thing, well, you said it creates winners and losers. It often does. But in general, I think if you do things in collaboration, there's always potential to do better than if you do it individually. So usually collaboration should help to have, in the end, more winners than losers.
Well, perhaps I just quickly come back on that. I think the question is, we take decisions in Europe which makes the cake bigger. If you look at something like trade, it's absolutely clear that trade has made a significant contribution to European economies. If you look at the single market, you can see that the single market has generated significant growth. If you look at the euro, whatever you say about the euro has led to a great reduction in fluctuations in currency markets, if you look at it historically. It brings all these benefits, the cake gets bigger. The question is the cake being distributed fairly enough? And I think at the moment there is a feeling that in Europe, and this is part of the discussion about globalization, that we have to share the benefits of this cake better, and we have to find ways of doing it. And that is perhaps the key challenge, is how do you make sure that these benefits are spread to people more broadly, that people don't feel that they are the big losers, and they watch everybody else doing better.
Thank you. There was one more question in the far back. Thank you.
Hi. My question goes to Mr. Reinshagen. Two questions. If I got your history right, after you did your PhD in Switzerland, you worked with McKinsey, right? So, and then you moved to own the Navis, or you work with Navis. So my question is, what are those vital moments, or like that pushes you from being a salaried employee from McKinsey and then moving to owning Navis. The second question is that, what are those challenges you face as an entrepreneur by working on your own company, on those initial stages of Navis?
Yeah, both kind of closely related questions. You know, being a consultant is a very very rich in experiences, because you see a lot of different companies, experience a lot of different firm cultures, work on a lot of different problems in various countries. However, I felt at some point in time, I do not only want to stand at the sideline and talk smartly about, you know, how you should do things, but rather give it a try and a shot myself. And I had that thought already for quite some years, but the opportunities that presented themselves were never of a kind where I thought, wow, you know, that's really something I absolutely want to do, and I'm going to quit my job and dedicate all my energy for the next years, you know, to that thing. And perhaps that's a little bit of a warning, you know, when you see to some extent that it is being advertised, everyone should found something. I still think that, you know, you will be surprised, you know, how much energy and dedication this will require from you. So you should be damn sure that you really absolutely believe that this is something that deserves so much of your energy and time. But I found this a absolutely unique opportunity. So one of my best friends, together with some other people I knew very well, had already developed a very significant body of knowledge. There were patents behind that. We could see that there was first customer interest. There were people who were really pushing us and wanted to put some first money into the company. And I thought, wow, you know, if I don't do this, I most likely end up staying a consultant for the rest of my life, and very likely I'm going to regret that. So that was definitely what, you know, nudged me over the edge. And, you know, once you are faced with that decision, you learn a lot about your own risk appetite, because I always thought I would have a certain liking, you know, for trying new things and going for that risk. But if you have to quit a job at McKinsey, that time I was a young partner and extremely well paid, and I knew I would make a step to pretty much no salary for the next year, and a very uncertain future of salary for the next few years to come. You definitely learn a lot about your risk appetite, and I'm very happy that I dared to make the step. I have never regretted it since, which of course in my case is a easy to make statement, because we were very successful, perhaps even beyond what we realistically could expect. So that is perhaps, you know, just reflecting on making that step and what that did teach me about myself. When it comes to the challenges, of course, they are kind of plentiful, and we had a couple of very close to death experiences when we were running out of money in the very early days. Our product was still not ready, and we had only a very few weeks of time frame to close our next round of funding. And of course, we had awesome months in sales, but we had bad months in sales as well. So this is, whatever you are founding, this is really going to be a crazy roller coaster ride, and if you don't have the stomach for that, you better shouldn't get in. So that's as well I can tell you. Yeah, I don't want to occupy too much of speaking time on that, because that's kind of really something that is so rich in experience. So if you've got something that really strikes you as an awesome idea and a good team to start with, I would still recommend to everyone, you know, to give it a try, even if it's going to be kind of a hard time with a lot of ups and downs.
May I add a question to you? You described you internationalized first within Europe, and in a second step also to the US and China. If you compare these steps, I guess you noticed in some regards the single market. Can you briefly sketch that, the experience for a startup to internationalize in Europe and then beyond Europe?
That was exactly the thinking, you know, why we focused entirely on Europe in the beginning before we made the step to China and to the US and to the Middle East. Because it was, from a pure tax and logistics perspective, it seemed a lot easier to us, and we in the beginning had filed for our patents in Europe, so we felt better protected there. And of course, it was as well a matter of reducing travel times in the beginning. Surprisingly, I found then the step to go really kind of overseas to the US and to China a smaller step from there than we had originally anticipated. We had some big pain when it came to something like international transport of batteries. So we're using these big lithium-ion batteries, and it's really a pain to ship them somewhere. So in Europe, you can do everything in a truck, and that's no problem. But to the US or to China, you have to fly them over. And these batteries have they store a lot of energy, and you can't transport them in a normal airplane because it's kind of too dangerous. That was actually the biggest problem we faced. Sounds like a small thing, but cost us ridiculous amounts of trouble and costed a lot of money. So I think for our very specific product, the problems were smaller than we expected to go beyond the realm of Europe. And the problems that we still faced at the end were very different from the ones we thought. We are extremely rigid when it comes to payment rules and all that stuff. So we just don't want to bother with the trouble of running after our money with overseas clients. So if we sell a trolley to China, we expect them to wire the whole amount upfront before we even start shipping. I think the product is unique enough to allow us this practice. I think once we will have more competition, we'll see a larger gap opening between the practices and how advantageous they are on the European market compared to what we can allow ourselves in China or the Middle East.
Okay. So tariffs and stuff is not a major hurdle, it appears.
Right now, it is much less of a trouble, I thought. Yeah, you always start, moving into this with certain expectations, and we wanted to follow the guidebook, of course. The things I had over the time tried to give my clients at hand. Start small, really tackle market deep before you expand. Leverage the advantages of a single market. We expanded faster than we thought because we got so much inbound. And really, the hurdles that we faced were different than we thought. But I think it's really difficult to transfer that to, for example, a consumer product. So that is our experience. And as I said, I think it's hard to transfer that over if you're a consumer electronics company. I think it will look very different.
Thank you. More questions from the audience.
Thank you. Maybe with regard to your question, Professor Henkel, what would you say, Felix, would be necessary that you don't call going to another European market in internationalization?
I think, we from the beginning on did everything only in English. So we are an entirely English-speaking company because even before we went to, we started selling anything, we had so many international people on the team that there was pretty much no choice to do everything in English. And we wanted to not bother with translating our website and material in a lot of different languages. And I think that is the much larger barrier right now. It's the language barrier and still like the local network barrier, which unfortunately is very hard to overcome. So look at France, for example. You would expect us to sell super easily into France. However, we don't have anyone on the team, on our sales team, who is really super fluent in French, and we don't have anyone who has deep roots in and brings kind of a senior network in the French industry. I think that's much more of a barrier than anything trade-related. I think we have not seen any barriers there when it comes to any tax-related or setting up a local subsidiary or something like that. All the problems have been taken away. However, founding a subsidiary in the US was as well remarkably easy. You pick the right lawyer, you pay 20,000 euro, and you have a company there. So really, overcoming the language barrier and having access to that local network for us was a much harder thing. But that is, we are selling to decision makers in big corporates. And that is a very specific niche market, and so I can only talk to that. And we are really seeing all the problems now. We want to make the step to France, to Spain, to the Middle East. So what we've learned now is we first need to hire the right person who can open up that market. And that's usually a very experienced salesperson who has lived in that country and already worked in the very specific industries we want to sell to and brings his personal network. And then usually it just works all by itself, but you need that person, and that is your real entry to that market. And it's absolutely less about these kind of bureaucratic problems nowadays. It's much more about this kind of personal entry point.
Thank you. If I may, I have a different kind of questions to students here.
Yeah, I think I have a question
Please, go ahead.
Sorry. So we talk about China. Chinese market is very important for European Union. So 2nd June, there was a meeting between European Union and China. And after the meeting, Angela Merkel said that European countries have to depend on themselves now because Donald Trump, he makes sometimes some, I don't know, strange ideas. And so I'm wondering if, because the situation, because Donald Trump, will European Union and China have even stronger relationship with each other? So what kind of cooperation do you see in the future that will be even stronger between China and the European Union?
It's a very big question, but I'll try and be brief. I think the first thing is that there was quite a good article in the Financial Times this morning, which said that Donald Trump, paradoxically, had probably done more to improve free trade than anybody else for the last, I don't know how many years, simply because he had reminded everybody about the importance of the multilateral trading system. And I think that Europe sees itself as very committed to a multilateral trading system based on rules. And at the same time, I think China sees itself increasingly as dependent, as a strongly export-based nation on this. And I think there is an increasing alignment of interests for trade. But I also see this in terms of business and cooperation. I'll just say from my policy perspective, which is innovation policy, we see increasing exchanges. I go to the OECD, and we have discussions together with China about how we solve policy issues together. If you look at issues like climate change, the use of technologies to address this, there are a lot of commonalities between China and Europe. So I think that on all of these questions there will be potentially, if Donald Trump remains on the position he is at the moment, a kind of rapprochement. I think that there are still differences in views about political systems and things like this. But certainly in terms of policy, I think there will be more and more contact. I think in any case, irrespective of Donald Trump, China has become a very, very important player in international markets at all sorts of levels. And Europe has to adapt to the new world. And I think, as you said, I was very struck by what you said about your expansion into China and the fact that, okay, I mean, there can be copycats. But it's the question of moving fast. And talking to Chinese policymakers, they are aware that even the imitation model in the longer term is not sustainable. And therefore, they're looking at new ways of cooperation.
I'm just wondering, will China be the country? Be the country who have the biggest import and export relation with the European Union some days, maybe? And will you expect that in the next 5 years?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think clearly, Europe has a lot of things to export. It is also a big importer. So we will have to see if there's a shift in terms of trade patterns from the United States or not. I think difficult to say. But I think China and Europe will work closer and
We'll
closer.
be closer.
I would like to just add one thing, just to be kind of do justice to China as well. I think already over the last years we've really seen a big change in how the Chinese government handles these IP and copycat topics. So as China is moving on to becoming a knowledge economy themselves, and I think they are already the number 2 globally in numbers of patents filed. I think 2016 that was true already. I think there is now a very strong self-interest, to protect intellectual property. Just look at Japan, after the Second World War, they copied pretty much everything. And there was very little you could do about it, but nowadays I would feel entirely sure and secure with my intellectual property in Japan. And I think, as you have much more to lose with your own intellectual property being stolen by others, suddenly this becomes a very important topic for you. And usually you earn as an economy much less from these kind of cheap copycats as you are earning from, establishing your own kind of world-leading high-tech products. So, everything that we've experienced in dealing with Chinese law firms is that the level of protection you enjoy today is a very, very different thing from what you could expect 50 years ago, just to do China justice on this.
But here I would really give a comment on intellectual property or patent or copyrights as a Chinese. We have a saying in China that it's only my personal opinion. Copy may in some sense good for a country or for the economy, in the sense that we say, first we copied because we were so undeveloped. We don't have the technology, we copied, then we catch up them, and then we will be better than them. That was the idea we have about the copy maybe many years ago. And now Chinese government also give a lot of effort to protect the patent. Because China is not a country anymore who only copy the things and produce some things with bad quality and with a low price. If you go to Shenzhen, the South Innovation Center in China, you will notice that there are a lot of technology innovation happening there. So you see the iPhone, many components of iPhone is made there. And you also see, China is changing now, and also the environment for the protection of innovation is also changing. And I see that that can be also a challenge for European Union to conquer it with China in the future in innovation side, because China has a big population. This is a big, a lot of brains there. So I think there can be even more ideas happening there than here, because European countries are still small with much smaller population. So I'm also thinking about what do you see about the future in innovation side between China and the European countries?
Well, I met a lot of people from Shenzhen recently, and I was very, very impressed. I mean, clearly China has a tremendous potential, but I think the question is how do you look at innovation? I mean, we had the steam engine and the cotton jenny invented in the United Kingdom. We had the transformation of the chemicals industry in Germany. We had the computer chip essentially coming out of California. The question is perhaps the next big transformative technology will come out of China, which will have spillover benefits for the whole world. I think it's not helpful to think of innovation as a pie which is simply cut up and shared out. It's a pie which grows and spills over to other people. And I think it's in the interest of Europe that China becomes more innovative, that it raises its living standards, that its consumers want to buy more German cars. I think there's a potential for a win-win there.
I find that quite surprising. It's a very, I've now very regularly traveled to China. I think it's nothing special happening there, just perhaps despite the size. Like every economy that made it into the top group over the last 50 years after Second World War has been going through the same kind of cycle. That's why I quoted Japan. You know, after Second World War, Japan was kind of catching up quickly. Of course, not by immediately starting with kind of inventing a lot of new stuff, but by, of course, you know, first copying German cameras and TVs. But, you know, it's kind of always easy to catch up to a certain point. You see, like, every single economy, as it's kind of nearing a certain GDP level and a innovation level, it becomes much harder because it is so much easier to copy and so much harder to be genuinely innovative. So it's awesome if you see a big part of the world catching up so fast, and I would hope that we would see other parts of the world catching up as fast as well, like South America, Africa. However, every prediction in the past, you know, of a country then continuing right through that kind of current top global level of innovation has proven not to work. You know, in the late 80s, everyone was predicting Japan would kind of be owning the world in only 10 years, but it proved to be much, much harder to kind of go beyond that level because suddenly, you know, you have to come up with all these new things. So I think we shouldn't be too worried. I think we should be very welcoming for every region that joined this group of top innovators in the world instead of, you know, being too afraid of that. Why? You know, I think everyone is going to profit from that. That's exactly, you know, why free trade and kind of a global exchange network is good.
Thank you. We have to conclude soon. Do you have 5 more minutes, Peter? Or is it...
It's getting very tight.
It's getting tight. Right. I would love to conclude nonetheless. Maybe we can just say you farewell, because I would love to hear one statement, Nadine, from you about the core thing, namely the target group here. But let me say farewell to our core speaker from the European Commission, Peter.
Thank you. And my apologies.